Greetings, and once again, welcome to Aspects of Valio. So today we're going to commence where we left off, where God's pronounced judgment on the ungodliness and rebellion against himself on the earth with the Deluge. So we're going to look at the Deluge narrative. To start with, let us begin with the understanding that this is an etiological narrative, not hard history. So, the Genesis Deluge narrative is found in chapters 6 through 9, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Old Testament. The story recounts God's decision to return the earth to its pre-creation state of watery chaos and then remake it in reversal of the creation. Now, I'm going to repeat this because this is essentially what this narrative concerns. God's decision to return the earth to its pre-creation state of watery chaos and then remake it in reversal of the creation account. So, everybody, even people who've got no religious convictions, know the story of Noah and his ark. But what actually does it mean? What is it saying to us today? But more importantly, what is it? So, essentially, there are three views of the Deluge narrative. The first view, needless to say, is the mythological interpretation, which suggests that Genesis 6 through 9 is a theologically motivated account redacted from two different literary sources. There are several literary sources for the Torah, but we won't waste time with them at the moment. Sufficient to say it's thought there were two sources brought together within this account, and that this account is largely borrowed from other ancient Near East, that should be ancient Near East, mythological flood traditions. The second opinion is that it relates to limited or local flood stories and theories. Such theories narrow the scope of the Genesis flood to a particular geographical location or locations, usually in Mesopotamia. And then, of course, there are the traditional views regarding Genesis 6 through 9 as a unified, historically reliable narrative describing a worldwide global flood. And this is where it becomes important. A worldwide global flood, which is written as a polemic against all other ancient Near East flood stories. Notice the use of the word stories as we go along and not histories. So then, of course, there is the non-historical view, which we need to look at, and we're going to really strengthen that here as we go along to find out what God is saying to us through this account of this three-stranded cord of God, land, and people. So, the non-historical view has been very well promoted by such outstanding scholars such as Gerhard von Rad and Walter Brueggemann, who insist on a non-historical interpretation of the Genesis flood narrative. Scholars such as these generally take the position that Genesis 6 through 9 is a mythological account. So, people following the non-historical view would posit that the final redactor of the Genesis narrative, redactor, let me just remind you, is a file editor, intended the Deluge narrative to be taken as a literal account as well as it having theological significance. However, in the light of modern science and the archaeological record, they suggest that the historical ancient flood narrative must be rejected as, note use the word hard, history in favour of recognising that it is essentially mythological and theological. Please remember that when we use the word mythological, this is a way of saying a story that illustrates a truth, not a fairy tale or something that's just made up for entertainment. Yeah? Mythological and theological. Thus, the early part of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is considered to be the first of three sections in Genesis, which are referred to as the principal narrative that contain tales, sagas, legends, folk tales, and so on. The rather good scholar, David Kleins, points out that in common with other narratives in the primeval history, we've explained primeval history, chapters 1 through 11, the flood narrative in 6 through 9 displays a pattern of sin, judgment, and mitigation of the penalty. And I think David Kleins makes that readily understandable. So, the folktale type of the myths of catastrophe, to which this story belongs, when considered purely as narrative, exhibits three kinds of explanation for the catastrophe of which it tells. In all cases, the catastrophe is thought to be sent upon humanity by God or gods, but the reasons for which it's variously believed to be are, because bear in mind, there's not just a one flood narrative in the ancient Near East, there are some more. So, reasons are, it's the will of God or gods, which is unfathomable to mankind. Secondary is that some non-moral fault in mankind has angered the gods. Number 3 is that a moral sin on the part of mankind elicited judgment. Only the cases of the second or third can a flood or other catastrophes be spoken to as punishment. So, we've set our backcloth, so let's look at some historical considerations. When attempting to find an all-encompassing view of the notices concerning the deluge, it is essential to place the biblical account alongside other literary forms or stories regarding the event. It was common practice in the ancient Near East or the ancient world to use an accepted event or a memory or assumed memory of an event to retell it in a figurative way to communicate a message of importance to the audience. there is good scriptural and historical evidence that the Deluge narrative is an interpretation of an actual historical event retold in the rhetoric and the theology of ancient Israel and other contemporary ancient Near East identities. So, the Genesis account is one of the many stories of catastrophic floods in the ancient world. So, let me just run through these very, very quickly. When the forthcoming book towards the theology of Israel, God, Land and People, is published, possibly in July, the things we'll be talking about will be written out at some length. But in the meantime, other accounts of a flood of similar magnitude appears firstly in the Epic of Gilgamesh. One of the ancient Near Eastern Deluge narratives of these, the best known is this one, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The very first surviving version is generally known as the Old Babylonian version, and that dates right back to the 18th century before the Common Era. And it's entitled after its incipit, Chateau El Shahri, Surpassing All Kings. And a few tablets of the original story have survived. So much I'd like to talk to you about this at great length. We'll just leave it at that. Probably the earliest surviving account of the flood outside of the scriptures is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The second one is the Sumerian flood myth, otherwise known as the story of Zisusudra, which is known from the single fragmentary tablet written in Old Sumerian, datable by its script to the 17th century before the Common Era or the Old Babylonian Empire. And the first part of this deals with the local creation myth and eventually moves on to a part, although between the creation thing and the deluge, that part's missing, but it moves on where the gods have decided to send a flood to destroy mankind. The god Enki, who's lord of the underworld, the sea of fresh water, sends various rulings to one of the kings to build a large boat. Next bit's lost. The terrible storm rages for 7 days, and the story goes on where various animals are put into a vehicle, and the main character prostrates himself before the sky god and lord of breath or wind, who endow him with breath eternal and take him to dwell in what could be called paradise. The next one is the Epic of Atrahasis. Again, an 18th century before the Common Era epic from Acadia, written in various versions on clay tablets that exist, named after its protagonist, Atrahasis. His name means exceedingly wise. And once again, it's a creation story and one of 3 variants of a Babylonian flood narrative. So we could talk about this at great length, but probably sufficient to say that this particular one probably has got the most fragments and so on. In this epic, Atrahasis is a tribal chief who survived with his family by floating in a boat down towards the Persian Gulf. And after the flood subsides, he goes out onto dry land, erects an altar, sacrifices to a water god, hoping that the flood will not happen again. The cause of the flood is explained that due to the multiplication of mankind, they've caused so much disruption and uproar that it's disturbed what we might call as the home of the gods, and particularly the sleep of Enlil, the god of the air and the wind. So we won't dwell any much more on that, but certainly to say all of these stories all centre around a judgment on mankind and a representative of mankind survives the flood. We'll take a break there.
As a musician, I can tell you that timing is everything. The beat of the drum, the pluck of the strings, the tinkling of the ivories, or the strum of the guitar. If you want the music to sound right, then you have to play in time. And if you're joining with others, everyone needs to play at the right moment. You know, it's the same with what God is doing. Our Creator is playing a melody, and the theme of the song is protecting His children. But like any orchestra, it's important that as we join in, that we too get the timing right. You see, timing is everything. And now is the time to become part of the orchestra that God is assembling. Our God-given purpose is to support and stand with the Jewish people. This is the greatest song you could ever sing and the greatest music you could ever play. Won't you join with the band, with Ezra International, as we join with what God is doing? Remember, timing is everything, and that time is now.
Welcome back. So let's get to the biblical narrative. And let's more or less start where we left off. I'm not going to read out the flood narrative because I'm assuming that everybody is at least vaguely familiar with it. But one thing I've noticed over all these years is we tend to take for granted that we know the biblical narratives on most things. But sadly we don't. We only know, what we might call reduced versions of it, or we've heard the story and we haven't actually read the text. So, I'm going to start off with a very brief introduction. Assuming that we know the full narrative, we've looked at the Nephilim, we looked at the Gibborim. Hope you found that as diverting, shall we say, as I did. And then we find that, this judgment is being brought forth. So the central character, of course, is, in English, Noah, but strictly speaking, it should be pronounced Noach, which, of course, is the Hebrew word for comfort or rest. Naomi, as in Ruth and Naomi, is a feminine version of the same name. So, let's start with a very simple question that's not usually even mentioned. Who was Noach? Who was he? Fair question, that. Well, Genesis 5 through 9 provides us with the essential information concerning Noach, his life, and his family. So let's start. Noach was in the 10th generation of the human race, and he was given the name Noach by his father, as the term means comfort or rest. So Genesis 5:9 says that his father, Lamech, says, and he called his name Noach, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So Noach, of this 10th generation from Adam, is going to bring rest from the curse on the ground. The thing that Lamech didn't realise when he spoke these words was the manner or the casus belli that would bring this to pass. So, what do we know from that point in time? We know that Noach was married and he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or Japheth. Each of them had their own wife. Noach's wife, along with his sons' wives, are unnamed. So we know absolutely nothing about them at all, what the names were, how we met, what the situations were, which families they came from. We know absolutely nothing. Neither in the narrative are there any biographical details, such as his occupation. Was he a farmer, a shepherd, a tender of vines? What was he? Fisherman? What did he do? No, nothing. Was he a builder? We know nothing about him at all. What we do know, however, is that his grandfather, Methuselah, oldest man in the Bible, and his father Lamech were alive while the ark was under construction. We're also told that Lamech fathered other sons and daughters in 530. Again, not a single detail concerning them, their names, if they got married, had children, what, we know absolutely zero about them. So sadly, we're left with the conclusion, because of their absence from the narrative, they perished with the rest of all mankind in the deluge. That is Noach's brothers and sisters and their families. All that we know is that Noach walked with the Lord and found grace in his sight. Genesis 6, 8 through 9, Ezekiel 14, 14 to 20. In the New Testament, is also described as a preacher of righteousness in the Pseudo-Pauline 2 Peter 2:5. The writer of the Hebrews says he was motivated by faith and godly fear in Hebrews 11:7. So the next thing that we're faced with is the construction of the ark and those that entered the ark. But I'm going to look at those actually in the next section, and that leads us more into what happens afterwards. Because all good narratives, all good stories, and all good teaching should really have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So, let's move on. The notice relates that the rains that created the flood lasted for 40 days in Genesis 7:17. 40 days and 40 nights is not a hard mathematical number. As we've said before in previous broadcasts, it's a figurative number simply for a long time before completion. It also tells us that the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days in 724. And after these 150 days, the waters gradually receded from the earth. So by the 7th month and the 17th day, Noach's ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, Monday, Turkey, in Genesis 8:4. A year plus 2 months and 27 days later, the earth was dry enough so that Noach and his family and the animals could disembark from the ark. So, let's look at a little bit of help from geology, geography, and so on. Sedimentary rocks on all continents contain fossils that at one time were assumed to represent the remains of antediluvian life, leading to the assumption a worldwide flood was, in fact, a true, hard historical event. However, interlaid with the fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks that were found on all continents, containing fossilized mud cracks, mineral compounds, and what are known as red beds, which are dried oxidized iron deposits, formed to different thicknesses on different continents, more than 1 kilometre, which is 3,281 feet deep. As there's only one time in which floodwaters are said to recede and leave the earth dry, the geological record would illustrate that there were a great series of floodings and dryings, a great deal of them, across the world, more or less, throughout the historical process. On that basis, the story cannot describe a whole earth flood on a large scale, i.e. all the world, but it can, from the geological and fossil record, because of red beds in particular, show very large scale regional floods. So let's look into the area. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow through what was known as Mesopotamia. If you're not familiar, I hope I've mentioned this before, probably not. Mesopotamia is drawn from two words. Meso, middle, Potamus, or Potamia, rivers. So Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers. Okay, which of course brings us to our area where the Tigris and the Euphrates flow through what was known as Mesopotamia. There are several layers in exposed rocks adjacent to the two rivers that the geological record would show are extremely likely to be flood deposits. Most of these are about a foot thick, but one is 9 to 10 feet thick, and that is carbon dated to roughly 2,900 years before the Common Era. In a similar manner, let me say that again. In a similar manner, flood deposits 2.4 meters thick are also reported as far northeast as the ancient Babylonian city of Kish. So, these flood deposit layers illustrate that the flooding in southeastern Mesopotamia was not unusual, but on occasion must have been very vast. Now, the watershed for the Euphrates and the Tigris, on which a flood could have occurred, extends for more than, ready for this, 1,600 kilometres, which was stretched from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia into Syria and into Turkey, and laterally about 1,000 kilometres from eastern Saudi Arabia southwest to Iran, covering an area of 1.6 million square kilometres. Wow. There was a flood. It was there. Did it cover the whole earth? Well, I would suggest it did, but not the whole geographical world. Very quickly, because we've only got 2 minutes left. Because of the curvature of the earth, the horizon drops from where the viewer is standing. However, the drop is proportional to the square of the distance between the viewer and the object on the horizon. From these statistics can be seen that such a character as Noah, standing on the deck of a large craft approximately 7.8 meters above the water, would not be able to see the tops of any hills as high as 15 miles in hours from as little as 24 kilometers away across the floodplains covered in water, because the curvature of the earth presents it vis-a-vis from a person standing on an ark, and bear in mind a craft with no navigation and no propulsion, drifting, wouldn't have to go too far to where there was nothing in sight. In the ancient world, if you were on a boat, nothing in sight, their whole world was flooded. So, it's important to remember the narrative was shaped for an ancient people with a completely different perspective on any number of matters. So the next time we're going to look at some speculation on geophysical things again, but we'll also look a bit more thoroughly at maritime construction. We'll have a look at the animal on the ark and the animal migrations afterwards, and we'll look at a number of misunderstandings. So I'm just going to close and say the final recension of the Deluge narrative as the author recasting older oral material into a narrative using ancient literary conventions to teach about the consequences of sin, judgment, and God's mercy for his creation, which involves God, land, and people. So until we meet again for the next, I hope, exciting episode, God be with you until we meet again.